See military uniform and full dress for wider coverage of dress uniforms. Dress uniform is the most formal military uniform, typically worn at ceremonies, official receptions, and other special occasions, with order insignias and full-size medals. The dress uniform correspond to the civilian white tie dress code. Uniform design may be distinct to a service or to a regiment or branch of service, although they are often brightly colored and adorned with ornaments. Most originated as practical uniforms that, with the adoption of even more practical uniforms, have been relegated to ceremonial functions, although many services use the term dress generically for uniforms, allowing it to refer to more modern combat uniforms, with suitable modifiers e.g., the British Army's obsolete battle dress, and the U.S. Army's obsolete battle dress uniform. The term dress uniform, without a prefixed modifier, is always assumed to refer to the full, ceremonial dress. Argentina. In the armed forces of the Argentine Republic, the Argentine Federal Police, Argentine National Gendarmerie and Naval Prefecture, dress uniforms are worn during military and civil occasions, especially for the military bands and color guards. They are a reminder of the military and law enforcement history of Argentina, especially during the early years of nationhood and the wars of independence that the country was a part. The Argentine Army's regimental dress uniforms date back from the 19th century, and are best worn by the Regiment of Patricians, the Horse Grenadiers Regiment, and the 1st Artillery Regiment in the Buenos Aires garrison. But the full dress uniform of the Argentine Army as a whole is green with a visor cap, epaulettes, sword set and scabbard, long green pants, a black belt, and black shoes or boots. The Argentine Navy dress uniform is a navy blue polo shirt with a visor cap for officers and senior ratings and sailor caps for junior ratings, epaulettes and sleeve rank marks, a sword set and scabbard for officers, blue long pants, a belt and black leather shoes or boots. Marines wear peaked caps with the dress uniform. Epaulettes are only worn with the dress uniform. For the Argentine Air Force, a similar uniform to one used by the Royal Air Force is used, however the color used is much brighter. Regardless of service branch, military police personnel wear helmets with their dress uniforms, plus armbands to identify service branch. Canada. Canadian Forces dress uniforms for regiments in the Canadian Army vary depending on the regiment. Regulations for the wear of uniforms are contained in the Canadian Forces publication Canadian Forces Dress Instructions. Amendments to dress regulations are issued through the Office of the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, initially in the form of a CANFORGEN message, which is placed in the dress manual until an official publication amendment can be promulgated. Dress regulations may also be amplified, interpreted, or amended by the commanders of formations and units through the issuing of standing orders, ships standing orders, routine orders, and standard operating procedures. This may include amplification where the regulations are unclear or are not mandatory. Amendments are reversal of some existing regulations for special occasions or events, or the promulgation of regulations regarding the wear of traditional regimental articles. Dress uniforms in the Royal Canadian Navy follow protocols outlined in the distinct environmental uniform introduced in the 1980s. Royal Military College of Canada. Since the Royal Military College of Canada at Kingston, Ontario was founded in 1874, the full dress uniform of an officer cadet has remained essentially the same. However, the pillbox hat has replaced the shako. The pith helmet remains in use for ceremonial parade positions only. Canadian cadet organizations, the Youth Cadet programs in Canada, the Royal Canadian Army Cadets, Royal Canadian Sea Cadets and the Royal Canadian Air Cadets each maintain their own dress uniforms. The uniforms are provided free of charge and funded by the Department of National Defence. Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The modern dress uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is closely based on the everyday uniforms used by the predecessor Northwest Mounted Police in the late 19th century. It features the famous red serge, a scarlet British-style military pattern tunic, complete with a high neck collar and blue breeches with yellow stripe identifying a cavalry history, and usually a campaign hat and brown riding boots. Chilean Army full dress. The German Feldgrau uniforms are the main full dress of the Chilean Army, while cadets of the Army Military School, Bernardo O'Higgins Riquelme, wear the Prussian blue uniform with a pig lab helmet. Some Chilean Army units wear the Army uniform during the War of the Pacific during parades, with kepis as headdress. The Buin Regiment has recently reintroduced the historic Army Infantry regimental uniforms of the Chilean War of Independence, having been formed in December 1810 as the 1st Infantry Regiment, Chilean Grenadiers, the Chilean Army's first constituent military unit, the 1st Cavalry Regiment and the 1st Artillery Regiment's Krupp Artillery Battery, both ceremonial units of the ground forces proper, have since 2012 wearing the early 20th century Prussian-style full-dress uniforms of the Army's cavalry and artillery branches. Chilean Navy full dress. The Chilean Navy's officers' dress uniform is naval blue with a visor hat, sword strap, black pants and boots. The enlisted uniform is a mix of Prussian and British influences, having a sailor cap with the dress, while the Marine enlisted and NCO uniform is a dark blue polo with pants and a belt plus a peaked cap. The uniforms of the Naval School Arturo Prat is also blue with pants, but with a special hat design, similar to those worn by Pratt and the crew of the Esmeralda during the Battle of Iquique in 1879. Chilean Air Force full dress. The 2001 Air Force uniform is a light blue polo and pants, black belt, sword strap, visor hat, and boots are black shoes with straps. Israel. In the Israel Defense Forces, dress uniform is rarely worn inside Israel. Until 2016, it was only worn abroad, either by a military attaché or by senior officers on official state visits. In 2016, Chief of General Staff Gadi Eisenkot announced that all officers ranked Tataluf as well as certain lower-ranked officers would wear the dress uniforms in official ceremonies on Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. Because of the small number of uniforms required, they are tailor-made from the specific officer. Each arm of the IDF has its own dress uniform, with separate versions for summer and winter. United Kingdom. British Army. Most of the various uniforms worn by the British Army today originate in former combat uniforms. At the start of the 19th century, British Army regiments of foot, trained to fight in the manner dictated by a weapon which demanded close proximity to the target, were not concerned with camouflage, and wore red coats. Rifle regiments, fighting as skirmishes, and equipped with rifles, were more concerned with camouflage however, and wore dark green uniforms. Light infantry regiments were also trained as skirmishes but wore red uniforms with green shakos, whereas the infantry generally wore polished brass buttons and white carrying equipment. The rifles wore black. Heavy Dragoons and Royal Engineers wore red coats. Most of the remainder of the British Army, however, including the Royal Regiment of Artillery, Hussars, all but one Lancer Regiment, and various support elements wore dark blue uniforms. These varied greatly in detail according to the arm of service or in many cases the individual regiment. Reserve units were for the most part distinguished by having silver lace buttons and accoutrements in full dress. For the Crimean War on, a narrow red stripe down the outside of each trouser leg was common to all red-coated infantry units. Cavalry, however, wore stripes of regimental colour on the riding breech. Scottish Highland regiments did not wear trousers, favouring the kilt, and Scottish Lowland regiments adopted tartan trews. All Scottish regiments wore doublets of distinctive cut instead of the tunics of English, Irish and Welsh units. Full-dress headwear varied. Bearskins were worn by the Foot Guards, the 2nd Dragoons and by Fusiliers. Plumed helmets were worn by the Dragoons, Dragoon Guards and the Household Cavalry. Hussars wore their distinctive busby, which also came to be adopted by the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers and certain other corps. It was also worn in a different form by rifle regiments. The Lancers had the chapka. Infantry of the line often wore shakos, as did others, though Scots and Irish regiments tended to have their own distinctive full-dress headwear. General officers and staff officers usually wore plumed cocked hats in full dress, as did regimental staff officers and those of some support services. In hotter climates, for all of the above, a white Foreign Service helmet was often substituted. Beginning with the Second Anglo-Afghan War of 1878, the British Army began adopting light khaki uniforms for tropical service that was first introduced in 1848 with the Corps of Guides in India. This innovation arose from experience fighting irregular forces in India, for example on the Indian northwest frontier and during the Indian Mutiny, and in Africa during the Anglo-Zulu War, as well as the invention of smokeless gunpowder and the increasing effectiveness and usage of rifles. In 1902, a darker shade of service dress was adopted for field and ordinary use in Britain itself. The scarlet, bluey and rifle green uniforms were retained for wear as full dress on parade and walking out dress when off duty and out of barracks, as worn between 1902 and 1914 by all non-commissioned ranks. Walking out dress was essentially the same as review order, except that a peaked cap at Glengarry was worn instead of the full dress headdress and overalls were substituted for cavalry breech. When khaki web carrying equipment was introduced, the earlier white or black leather carrying equipment was reduced to just the belt. For wear with the dress uniform, as with the earlier uniforms, the officers' uniforms differed in quality and detail from those worn by the other ranks. Officers purchased their own dress uniforms from regimentally approved Savile tailors, while other ranks were issued all orders of dress from government stocks. With the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, all full dress and other coloured uniforms ceased to be worn by the British Army. After 1919 they were restored to the Household Cavalry and Foot Guards for ceremonial purposes but not to the bulk of the army. Officers were authorised to wear full dress for certain special occasions such as court levees, and it was customary to wear these uniforms at social functions such as weddings. By 1928 bands were wearing full dress on occasions where they were not parading with the remainder of the regiment. The pre-1914 dress uniforms were still held in store and occasionally reappeared for historic displays. However, there was no serious attempt to make them general issue again, primarily for reasons of expense. When battle dress uniforms, which had a short blouse instead of a tunic, were adopted immediately prior to the Second World War, The older khaki service dress became a smart uniform for wear on the streets, and on moderately formal occasions. After World War II, the colored, full-dress uniforms were again reintroduced for ceremonial occasions by the Brigade of Guards and to a limited extent by regimental bands. Officers resumed wearing mess uniforms in traditional colors from about 1956 on. These are still worn, although regimental amalgamations have led to numerous changes from the pre-war models. The BD uniform was eventually replaced in 1961 by green, cotton combat uniforms. After World War II, the design of the other ranks' BD blouses had been modified for wearing collared shirts with ties, and was used for a time around the barracks, but eventually disposed of completely. With limited exceptions, the unique regimental full-dress uniforms finally disappeared after 1939. Today they are only generally worn on ceremonial occasions by the bands and corps of drums, by certain representatives on parade, and by the regiments of the household division. In most regiments they were replaced by a generic dark blue uniform known as No.1 This dated back to plain patrol uniforms worn by officers prior to 1914 as an informal undress uniform. An early version had been worn by some units in the 1937 coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, but had not been made general issue at the time. In the form adopted after World War II, most regiments were distinguished only by colored piping on the shoulder straps, colored hatbands, buttons and badges. However, Scottish regiments retained the kilt citreurs as well as the distinctive doublets of the former scarlet uniform. Rifles had all dark green uniforms, and cavalry retained a number of special features such as the crimson trousers of the 11th Hussars, the corded caps of Lancer regiments. A white, lightweight tunic was also authorized for use in the tropics, or during the summer months in warmer temperate climates. The blue home service helmets were not worn as part of the No.1 dress uniform, except by members of some bands or corps of drums which retained their old full-dress uniforms at regimental expense. English rifle regiments were amalgamated into the Royal Green Jackets, which continued to wear a dark green dress uniform, and black buttons and belts. Recent changes have brought the Royal Green Jackets and the Light Infantry together into a single regiment, the Rifles, which continues to wear dark green. Berets were introduced initially into the Royal Tank Corps in the First World War, and the use became more widespread in the British Army during and after the Second World War to replace side caps for wear with combat uniforms when protective headgear was not being worn. Originally, khaki was the standard color for all units, but specialist units adopted colored berets to distinguish themselves. For example, airborne forces adopted a maroon or red beret. This has since been adopted by many other parachute units around the world. The commandos adopted a green beret. The Special Air Service initially adopted a white beret, quickly changing this to a beige or sand-colored one. From 1944 they wore the Maroon Airborne Forces beret, but the beige beret was re-adopted following the reformation of the regular sash in Malaya. Khaki was replaced as a generic color for berets after the war by dark blue, and this is the color worn by those units not authorized to use a distinctively colored beret. Berets fall mostly outside the scope of this article, as a peaked cap with a colored hat band is intended to be worn with the No.1 dress uniform. Berets are the most common form of headdress seen with other orders of dress, and are worn in No.1 and 2 dress by some regiments and corps. A khaki peaked cap may also be worn by officers in some units with the No.2 khaki service dress. The blue or green No.1 dress was never universally adopted after its initial introduction in 1947. The reason was mainly one of economy, although it was sometimes criticized as being too similar to police and other civilian uniforms, lacking the immediately recognizable military status of both scarlet and khaki. Khaki No. 2 dress being the most usual order of dress for parades and formal occasions. As noted above, the practice of issuing other ranks in line regiments with full sets of both service dress and dress uniforms effectively ended in 1914 and was never completely returned to. Today, with the exceptions noted above, full dress and No. 1 dress uniforms are only held in limited quantities as common stock, and issued only to detachments on occasional special ceremonial occasions. Practices to, however, vary between units, and historic items of uniform are more likely to appear where tradition is particularly strong. As an example, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst wore scarlet and blue Review Order uniforms until World War I, substituted khaki service dress for parade from 1919 to 1939, and now holds dark blue No. 1 dress uniforms for the use of its cadets. The Royal Military Police retain the latter order of dress for general issue. Royal Air Force. Historically, the Royal Air Force regulations permitted the wearing of a full dress uniform in both home and warm weather variants. Although the home wear version of full dress is no longer worn, the tropical full ceremonial dress continues to be authorized. The temperate full dress uniform was introduced in April 1920. It consisted of a single-breasted jacket in blue-gray with a stand-up collar. Rank was indicated in gold braid on the lower sleeve, and white gloves were worn. As with the British Army after 1914, full dress was not general issue during the interwar period, but was authorized for wear by specific categories such as bandsmen and commissioned officers. The latter generally wore full dress only for infrequent occasions such as attendance at court levees and social functions such as weddings. Military attaches and royal aides-de-camp were amongst the few serving officers who might have regular occasions to wear full dress. Initially, the full dress uniform was worn with the service dress cap. However, in 1921 a new form of headdress was introduced. It was designed to resemble the original flying helmet, and it consisted of a leather skull cap trimmed with black rabbit fur. The helmet also featured an ostrich feather plume which was connected at an RAF badge. This helmet was never popular, and junior officers were eventually permitted to wear the service dress hat on full dress occasions. Group Captain H.R.H. the Duke of York wore RAF full dress at his wedding to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923. The Duke wore a carried the full dress headgear rather than the service dress cap. Royal Navy. Since the mid-18th century, when naval uniforms were introduced, flag officers had different full dress and undress versions, the latter being worn from day to day, the former only for formal occasions. By the late 19th century, an officer's full dress uniform consisted of a navy double-breasted tailcoat with white facings edged in gold, gold lace on the cuffs, epaulets, sword and sword belt, worn with gold-laced trousers and a cocked hat. This order of uniform lasted through the first half of the 20th century, and was worn by Prince Philip at the coronation of Elizabeth II. In 1956, however, it was abolished, leaving no one uniform is the most formal order of dress. Subsequently, just a few years later, full dress uniform was reintroduced in the form of ceremonial day dress, very similar to the old full dress, but without epaulets and slashes and worn with a peaked cap.